The tube map is an amazing piece of design because of its simplicity. So anybody can pick it up, look at it very quickly, even without knowledge of London's transport network. I think get a very quick bearing on how it is all. The complicated network is how it comes together. It's it's a great piece of design.
What Beck's actual motives were, I'm not sure we know. It's quite possible that he, being a draftsman, saw what was being offered to the public in his daily travels himself, and maybe just thought he could do something better.
I think in the early 1930s, London Underground was experiencing quite a large modernisation programme. There were new bits of line opening, new architecture used on the stations. There was even new tube stock. And lots of London Underground looked very modern, but the map didn't. And I just wonder whether Beck was just thinking this doesn't really fit.
The pocket maps and poster maps weren't terrifically good in the 1920s. They're sort of rather fussy, too much geography, not enough clarity. So he wanted to make it better, and he was curious as well. He thought, can I make it better? There's always an element of curiosity when you're trying something completely new.
As I've said many times, Beck didn't invent network diagrams. He'd certainly seen others and probably thought, let's see if we can do the underground map and see what happens. Anything more has just got to be speculation.
Okay, so what influenced Beck? Well, there's a lot of stories about that, most of which are just figments of the imagination. There's so many urban myths about that. I'm going to stick my neck out and say there's absolutely no truth whatsoever in the electrical circuit diagrams myth. This is perpetrated by people who should know better.
And also I wonder whether he got a bit of inspiration maybe from those wonderful things we call strip maps, the long, thin diagrams that were placed above the windows, because they go right back to 1908 Edwardian times, and they were constantly being used and updated by London Transport or by the Underground, and they were really quite extreme in the distortions that they were bringing in.
Hardly anybody's heard of the name George Dow. George Dow was also in the same sort of field of work as Beck was, but did a lot of work for the London North Eastern Railway, LNER as most people know it, and the LMS and so forth. And he had already designed small network diagrams for each of those railways, which appeared in the carriages of the trains. Is it coincidence? The trains that Beck travelled to work on every day. George Dow's first network diagram for the suburban services of the LNER appeared in 1929, which is 4 years before Beck's underground map.
What you have to bear in mind here is that what the maps, the official network maps are for the underground weren't necessarily best practice. There was a cartographic tradition there, and it was quite a conservative one. But all around Beck, looking at the non-network maps, everywhere else the information design was being fine-tuned to try and be as helpful as possible to passengers, and that's where Beck's inspiration must have come from.
What Beck actually did was straighten the lines out. So instead of having some curly lines that weren't geographically accurate but sort of looked as though they were, Beck dispensed with that.
There was a still slight hesitancy from London Passenger Transport Board in publishing that even though they're this radical, modernist, forward-looking organisation, they still put that slightly apologetic phrase on the first issue about a new look for an old map, or whatever the phraseology is. they were nervous. They knew this, how radical this was at the time. They're saying, is London actually going to accept this? It might accept this modernist architecture, but is it going to accept this real radical map? And I think that's actually far more interesting than what Beck was trying to do. And London Passenger Transport was trying to get a cohesive corporate view, which was this modernist view, so it fits in with that. But even they were still very nervous about the whole thing. Beck
had nothing to go on. He didn't have someone else's diagram, good or bad, to inspire him. This is his first shot, and he nails it. He creates a design that's actually really rather attractive right from his first go. But it's even more clever than that, because not only is Beck's design attractive, it's actually not very geographically distorting. If you look at Beck's first diagrams in the 1930s, they actually aren't twisting London about very much at all. So what he's doing is he's actually keeping London recognisably the same and then using his schematic techniques to enhance London. And that's really very, very clever thing to do indeed, because it means that when he presents his map to people, it's one, obviously an improvement in terms of simplification, and two, it's not upsetting them too much with the geography.
I'm sure he was a genius, but he didn't create all the elements of the map. A lot of the features already existed in other maps around London, in Berlin. There were diagrammatic maps. What he did was to bring those various elements together into a visual language. So the use of straight lines, the use of grids, all those things already existed, but he brought them together and said, okay, this is a code, this is a language in which to speak about London and its system. I think that was his stroke of genius.
My first reference point with any piece of what I would call information design is, has it fulfilled the purpose that it was intended for? Has it solved the problem that was perceived to be in place at the time? And looking at Beck's early maps compared with what had come before, I think what he did was very successful. He made using the map a lot easier than it had been before. Whether it's worthy of elevating into the sort of godlike status that we've got now, I rather doubt.
So what Beck does, he supplies a drawing. He doesn't, there's nothing we know about Beck's work to know he knew much about the printing process. So that drawing would have gone to someone else and they would have implemented the design, which means they would have actually redrawn the map to make it camera ready, and they would have typeset the map if necessary, and exactly how a map gets typeset, exactly where the station names get positioned, exactly how sharp a curve is. That then becomes something that gets influenced by the draftsman who's working on the map. And it's not just the draftsman having input, it's also the bosses. The bosses are going to see the drawing and they'll see that's very nice, but could you do it like that or that? And their input's going to start going in as well. So what you end up with is a design that's not the work of one person. There might be a name at the bottom of the map, but all sorts of other people have fed into it in the process and done stuff that the person who did the original drawing might not actually agree with or might not even know has happened. And so it's important not to read too much into a map when you see it, and try and get into the head of the designer by trying to overanalyze all the little fine details on it, because some of those might not be anything to do with the designer to begin with.
Beck was really an engineer, and he was a tinkerer, and he liked to keep fiddling with the design, to the point where I wonder possibly whether he fiddled a weeny bit too much, and that could have been his downfall.
And to start off with, is this very pure view of city as machine and humans acting as energy within that machine. For the first 20 years, there was a continual refinement of that. There was improvements, and the machine actually got more and more slick. And I think when you get to the white line connectors in 1954, 1955, that kind of era, the whole machine actually really kind of fits together. And it's actually really beautiful. I mean, if you look at the Holborn interconnector, when you've got the white line interconnectors, that's a really, really lovely bit of work. When it starts to go wrong is when he starts to put more stuff in.
It's very easy to look at history, because we're talking about 70, 80 years ago, through today's eyes, and that's always dangerous. But nowadays, as soon as something gets going, there's always someone with an opinion, and then there'll be a committee. And how much that happened in 1933, I wouldn't like to say. But I would imagine they didn't just let him do what he liked and get on with it. Oh, that's very nice, thank you very much, keep going. I think that's very unlikely. And of course, as soon as you get more than one opinion, you end up with a gradual muddle.
Some of his later maps have almost no diagonals on them at all, to the point where perhaps the simplification into vertical and horizontal has led the diagram to an area where perhaps it wasn't quite as powerful as his original one with the 45-degree angles.
Beck's maps evolved quite a bit. I mean, he was doing them from 1933 to I think 1960 was the last edition, and there was on average one or two coming out every year, so he did a lot of them. There was one experimental map, I'm assuming it's experimental, where he broke away from 45 degrees and used 60-degree angles and used interchange rings that look a little bit like the Olympic 5-ring logo. Actually, it's not a logo, but that doesn't matter. And one of the advantages of 60 degrees going that way as opposed to that way is it does convey a little bit more of speed. From a geometric point of view, they can be a lot more difficult to design, in that you can't avoid having triangles of lines on a network map. And when you have 60-degree triangles, you end up with pinch points where you just cannot put the names inside. There was only one pocket edition of it. It did appear in the ABC Rail Guide in black and white as well. But aesthetically, it's actually rather good, but I don't think it worked terribly well.
Yeah, so Beck's design goals, as they moved on with time, was to produce these sort of rather clever, very abstract maps disconnected from geography. But the more he disconnected the maps from geography, the more people potentially got upset with them. So, if we take Beck's original map as his design goal, he moved away from that in quite a catastrophic way, which really ultimately ended his career with London Transport.
His last one in 1960 was quite different from his first one in 1933.
The design of the map has evolved over many years. I remember some of the early editions, the colours were a little bit bland or conflicting. More modern day maps, all the lines have their own separate identities. So when you look at it, certainly all the vivid colours help. But people then look back at classic versions of it, and I think it's great to see how it has evolved over time. If the map had stayed the same, static, I don't think it would be such an icon. Again, it's part of the brilliance of its design is how it has evolved as the network has changed.
Why do people like the underground map? Well, it's colourful, it's got straight lines on it. If it's designed well, it's got nice design features. It's something that's captivating, elegant. It draws you in. Sort of, the very best maps with sort of clean geometry, clean lines, parallel lines, good coherence. There's something about them that sort of attracts people's attention. Then there's sort of the comfort factor that this sort of the underground map has been with us in diagram form since the 1930s, and it's obviously got a long history, and it's sort of reassuring to people to see the thing on the wall. It's sort of, it's something that's sort of a consistent background to their lives. It's always been there, always will be. So it's a combination of the affection of familiarity combined with this sort of, the purity of geometry that sort of keeps people hooked on it.
You go to another city, and even if it's got similar design principles, like Paris now has a grid map, it looks different. There's a different feel to it. Whereas you look at the London map, and you immediately say, that's London, that's my home. And so it builds a mental picture, and it's an iconic picture. It says London to you. And I think that successful maps do have that certain quality of place to them.
You think of how many people there are who live in London or who interact with the city in some way on a regular basis. It's well over 10 million. You're probably talking about 12, 13, 14 million people have some kind of personal relationship with this city. But they will all interact with it in different ways. Like all different places will mean different things to them. You know, so for some people, like Shoreditch, for example, might mean somewhere they used to go clubbing when they were 25. For others, it's like, you know, Silicon Roundabout and the tech community. For others, still, it's kind of, you know, it's a bit of a dump from 40 years ago when they were growing up there or something. You know, everyone has a very different conception of the sort of the symbolism of London. And one of the only things that kind of draws everyone together, and that is a common reference point for literally everyone, is the tube map. It's the thing that everyone will sort of be able to point to themselves on. It's the thing that everyone will be able to kind of locate themselves on. It's kind of a sort of universal language for engagement with the city.
And the tube map is probably the most famous piece of London design. It's visually iconic. When you think of London, you do think of the tube map, as well as Big Ben and the Shard and all those kind of things. So with it being such a big part of London's visual identity, people love the tube map because they love London.
We talked about it being iconic, and it has indeed been replicated in many different forms. As a pastiche, it was replicated only a year or two after it was first made public in the 1930s. There were people making a pastiche of Beck's map. And ever since then, it's appeared on T-shirts and mugs and underpants and ties and all sorts of things. It's a thing of beauty. And I think it will be very hard for London Underground to find a modern design that's quite as beautiful as Beck's original.
I mean, the thing about an icon, it transcends practicality. I mean, it'd be interesting that if you got a map and took all the words off it and took, you know, every bit of information, but just left the lines there just as they are. Even on the most modern map, if you've got the most recent map with all the daft stuff they got on there now, and just gave that to anybody, if you took it to South America, put it onto a table and said, "What's that?" people would say, "That's London." And I think whether you like it or not, it almost transcends that. And I think that's really what defines what an icon is.
But we have to be clear what we mean by iconic and design. The word iconic now has become so diluted, it basically just means something which is exceptionally good and recognizable. And the tube map is exceptionally good and recognizable. But the word iconic used to have a much more specific meaning, that it was an image that stood for something. And in a way, the London tube map is. It's become our picture of London. When we Londoners think of London, we think of the tube map. Our concept of where West Hampstead is in relation to Bermondsey is in relation to the map. We picture places as being on the map. And so it does get disconcerting when we find geographically some places are more close together or separate than we thought on the map. So it's iconic in that more technical sense of being a picture that tells us something about the structure of London.
The tube map's an iconic piece of design because everyone who visits London, whether you live here and you commute every day or you're a visitor the first time, the tube map is often the first thing you look at before you start a journey. So many people are familiar with it, and it's become an icon like the red buses or the black taxis or the pillar boxes. The tube map is London, and a lot of people actually think of the tube map as a way to represent London. If you tell people you live in a certain place and it happens to be on the tube map, people will know where it is because they're familiar with the map.
It's certainly become a hugely well-known emblem of London and London Underground. But is that what we want it for? Isn't it supposed to help people find their way around? I don't think I want an icon. I think I want a map I can use.
An image can be iconic. So the Mona Lisa can be iconic. You know, a picture can be iconic. A trademark can be iconic. You know, the British Airways logo can be iconic. The London Underground roundel can be iconic. But a genre isn't iconic. So Beck's map can't be iconic. So when it was voted as being a design icon years ago, you sort of scratch your head and say, well, what do you mean exactly?
People talk about the design of the tube map, but there isn't one design. It's changed over the years. The map of 1934 is very different from the map of 2004 or 2014. It's changed in many ways. I think what people tend to think of are certain constant characteristics, such as the grid. and such as the simplicity of the lines.
And TfL has now, London Transport beforehand, not so much, make a huge amount of money out of it in licensing and so forth. And I could understand their reluctance to ditch it. But it really is time for something better.